Hi, everyone. This is the National Women's Law Center. We'll be getting started in just a few minutes. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started in just a minute. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar from the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund and the National Women's Law Center Fund, LLC. Today, we'll be discussing in more detail the outreach grants that we mentioned on the webinar last week. For those of you that were on the webinar last week, the first few slides may seem repetitive, but never fear, we'll be going into more details, and we're also leaving lots of time to answer questions. I'll be joined on the webinar today by my colleague Caitlin Lowell, who's the Program Coordinator for the Legal Network for Gender Equity, and Sharon Tajani, who's the Director for the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. So we are going to post a recording of today's webinar on our website, www.nwlc.org. We'll also be sending out a follow-up email, which will contain all the relevant links to last week's webinar, today's webinar, and information for the application process for the outreach grant. For those of you who have questions during the webinar today, please use the chat function. If you see the GoToWebinar sort of menu box, there's a selection that has chat. So feel free to send it to the entire audience from the drop-down menu, because I'm sure many of you have the same questions. We don't anticipate the webinar lasting more than 45 minutes, and we should be able to get through the information fairly quickly because we want to leave time for a lot of questions. So the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund emphasizes providing funds and legal assistance for low-wage workers. Through the outreach grants, we want to let workers know how to connect to the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, to know their rights, both under federal, state, and local law, and to be supported during the process of finding representation are seeking to enforce their rights. So we're going to review some highlights from the application process, and then, as I said, we'll be providing more detail. And I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Caitlin Lowell.
Hi, everyone. So again, this is going to be going over a little bit of what we went over last week, but the objectives of these outreach grants is to reach low-wage workers, especially communities of color, LGBTQ communities, especially transgender communities, immigrant communities, especially communities with language barriers, and people with disabilities, to ensure that everybody, including folks who may experience multiple forms of barriers to accessing legal assistance, are supported and are able to contact us through the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund and get connected to attorneys. So the goals of these outreach grants are to ensure that survivors and people that have experienced workplace sexual harassment, 1, know how to contact the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, 2, know their rights regarding workplace sexual harassment and retaliation, and 3, receive non-legal assistance as they go through the process of finding representation or seek to enforce their rights. So essentially, we know that there are so many different steps through the process where folks can fall through the cracks when it involves reaching out to get legal help and reaching out to attorneys and even knowing your rights in the first place. And we know that grassroots groups on the ground are especially well suited to support this work to ensure that everyone who is experiencing workplace sexual harassment can get the help that they need. So eligible applicants, these are going to be nonprofit organizations, and we're going to be looking for an established history of successfully working with grassroots membership and low-wage workers. And again, we're looking for strong connections to the communities that we're trying to serve. So we're especially looking for strong connections with communities of color, LGBTQ communities, immigrant communities, especially communities with language barriers, and folks with disabilities. Other flags for this is you don't have to be a legal group to apply. So it's not only legal organizations that can apply or are eligible for these grants, it's any nonprofit organizations that have ties to these communities and are working in these communities in a grassroots way. Additionally, networks of member organizations can apply and provide pass-through grants to members, because this has also been a question that we've been getting. This slide is hopefully helpful for saying essentially what kinds of projects are eligible. So funding for outreach to help people learn about and access help from the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. Funding for staff time for service coordination to help connect individuals with language or accessibility barriers with the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund and Time's Up attorneys. Funding for Know Your Rights workshops on workplace sexual harassment and related retaliation. And funding for Train the Trainer models to support community members to share their stories or conduct outreach in their own communities. And so these are just examples of projects that we would consider falling into the kind of category of projects that we would fund. And we're really hoping that organizations are creative and come to us with their own ideas that they feel would meet this criteria. And this is also detailed in the application, but some examples of projects that we're not funding through these outreach grants are direct services for survivors like hotlines or rape crisis centers, lobbying or policy campaigns, direct legal services, and research projects. And again, if you have any questions about if you're thinking of a project, you're wondering whether it's the kind of thing we would be considering eligible or not, you can reach out to us via email afterwards, or can ask more generally in the chat function throughout the webinar. So for the evaluation criteria is going to take into account a range of factors, including strengths of ties with low-wage communities, and an established history of conducting Know Your Rights work and providing assistance to low-wage communities. For timeline, the project should be starting in late 2018 and completed within 2 years. And for the amounts of grants, the maximum grants that we're giving to any organization is $50,000 for this year, and the total amount of grant money that we will be dispersing this year is $500,000. And finally, here are the key dates. So May 16th was the webinar we had last week that went over a little bit more about how people can seek legal help from us, how attorneys can join the network, and some overview of what we've been up to as the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund over the past few months. We have posted those slides on our website and also the recording. If you haven't gotten that and would like that, I can send it to you. The funding application is now open. So if you go to nwlc.org/outreach-grants, you can see the application there, which goes over, again, all of the criteria and also the application form that you would just download, fill out, email back to us. Today, we're doing this Q&A webinar, and the application for funding closes on June 29th. Then we'll be reviewing applications throughout the month of July and be announcing the funding applications that are chosen by August 6th. And again, just because this is our first question and answer webinar, we're still really hoping that if folks have any questions throughout the process of applying, please reach out to us. And that is all that we wanted to cover. So again, from now on, we're just going to be opening things up to questions from the group. So if you want to fill out questions in the chat box in the webinar screen, if you type it and say send to the entire audience, then we will receive it there and we can answer it. Or if you want to, if it's easier for you to email, or if you're having technical difficulties with that, if you send an email to our outreach grants with an S, at nwlc.org, we have that email open too. And to start, while we wait to get more questions, we're going to start going over some of the common questions we've received and some answers to those to get folks started. So one of the questions that we have gotten is, are unions or 501c5 labor organizations eligible to apply directly for funds? And the answer for that is yes, all nonprofits are able to apply for funding. And if you have any questions about that, definitely reach out to us.
So staying on that theme, Caitlin mentioned earlier that networks of organizations or collaborations of several local groups could apply and provide pass-through grants for their members. Sharon, can you say a little bit more about how the application process would work for a network, and then how the possibility of the money coming through the individual organizations would work?
Sure, I'd be glad to. This is Sharon Tajani. I'm the director of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. If a group is a collaboration of several local groups, they can apply. We would suggest that the coordinating body apply and include in the application whether the project could be scaled up even further with more funds. For example, if $50,000 would increase the number of outreach events in 10 local groups by 20 events, let us know that with more money, more local groups could have even more events. And we'll take that into account.
So staying on this theme for a minute, we have another question. Could an organization apply for the outreach grant in collaboration with a local legal services provider who's applying for the attorney funding from the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund?
This is Sharon again. The attorney funding is specific to a case. And so these two things, the organizations can certainly apply and the attorneys can apply for the case, but I don't think that the money will be considered together or the application will be considered together, because the criteria for cases is different than the criteria for these outreach grants.
Okay. And just to follow up on that, there's a question that I think we can answer. Will you be accepting grant applications written jointly from nonprofits? So can two nonprofit organizations jointly apply for an outreach grant?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Even if one is a legal nonprofit and the other is a grassroots partner, for instance?
Yes, although I want to stress that the point of these grants is to do outreach. And so as long as the grant follows that model, yes, we'd be interested in it. We're not going to be funding direct legal services.
And we have a few questions about the sort of amount of the grants. Is the total amount an organization can receive $50,000 per year, or is it $50,000 for the 2-year period total?
It's thank you. It's $50,000 for the 2-year period.
Right. So it could be $25,000 per year, or it could be allocated sort of depending on how the organization reflects that in the budget in the application, or is there some other criteria that would determine sort of how the money is spread across the 2 years?
No, you're absolutely right, Maya. It's up to how people want to budget it in their application.
Nancy, you have a call holding on line 1.
So in terms of, again, sort of the substantive work, Sharon, can you say a little bit about what constitutes non-legal information in the work that the funding can be used for? For example, someone said, can part of the funding be used to develop outreach and educational materials?
Yes, certainly part of the funding can be used to develop outreach and educational materials, as long as those outreach and educational materials have to do with teaching people their rights about sexual harassment.
And to follow up on that, and to clarify something we said earlier, things that will not be funded include lobbying, research, and direct services to survivors, like a hotline or rape crisis, correct?
Correct.
Okay. In terms of the kinds of things that will be funded, will you fund both staff time as well as supplies and other items needed for the project?
Yes, we anticipate funding both of those things if that's what the project needs.
Great. So we might have answered this before, but this has a very specific context in terms, again, of the types of non-legal assistance that could be funded. Could a hybrid legal social work nonprofit that serves the immigrant community apply for funding for their social workers to provide support to survivors?
I think I'd have to see the proposal, or we can talk offline. We're not thinking that these grants are going to be used for direct services support, but if it's support that then leads them to know their rights, or support that then leads them to be able to bring forth their claim of sexual harassment, that would be different. So it depends a little bit more on the details. So that's a great question for us to follow up with either by email or by phone.
So there are a lot of questions about priorities in terms of geography, cities, states, or regions, or particular areas. Can you speak to a little bit about that, Sharon?
So I tried to think about if there was a specific geographic area that we haven't touched, and I looked at the intakes we have. As you can imagine, we have lots of intakes from the larger states. We have fewer intakes from the South, so I would be interested in those. We have many intakes from California and New York, but I haven't been able to break down what communities we're hitting with those intakes yet. And so we don't really have a great idea of where geographically we're low, other than I know that we would expect more from the South and Texas and Nevada and New Mexico than I've seen currently. But generally, I think we're open to all geographic regions right now.
Great. So a couple of specific questions about training and outreach. What training or education will Time's Up provide to or require for staff, I guess, of organizations applying to participate in outreach?
We have not put together any requirements. We will have reporting requirements and some calls for the organizations that get these grants. If you're an organization that would like help developing the materials, we'd be very happy to work on them with you. Here's another question. Do you have an idea how many outreach events you want organizations to do per year? don't. I think it depends a great deal on the organization and their staff and the geographic region they're trying to cover.
Okay. So a few more questions about the type of work that could be funded. Someone has a question about campaigns. If they organize and work directly with survivors as part of a C3 campaign, would that qualify for funding?
I think it would depend on what the campaign is about. If the campaign is about teaching workers about their rights and giving them access to legal resources that will let them exercise those rights, then it could. If the campaign is more about social services, then probably not.
Okay, and a couple of more questions again about the substance of what the outreach or know your rights work could involve. Could it focus on harassment based on pregnancy or lactation?
That's a good question. We have been focused on sex harassment, and I can easily see how harassment based on pregnancy and lactation could fall into that category. This is one I think we should have a further conversation with, either by email or by phone.
Okay, so yes, so for those of you where we feel like we need to talk in a little more detail, please email us at the outreach grants email, and so they can follow up and so we can have a more detailed discussion with you about that. So another question about outreach around rights. Would that include training or education to develop leadership of workers and help them engage in an analysis around the root cause of sexual harassment? Or does the focus of the training and education need to be about people's legal rights?
I don't know that we've reached a decision on that question. Certainly we've been envisioning it more as about their legal rights, but I could see how a project like that could indeed help with sexual harassment a great deal. Let's talk a little bit more about that, because I don't want people spending their time making the applications if we don't think we can fund them, but let me talk to you more about that one.
Okay, great. So again, if you can email the outreach grants email address, we can follow up with you in more detail. There are some questions about the funding. So to answer one question, this is not a government grant. This is coming from the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund funds. Can you say a little bit more about that, sort of the source of the funding?
Sure. The source of the funding are donations that we have received. It is not government money.
And it's not philanthropic or foundation money?
No, it's not.
Is this a one-time funding opportunity, or will there be opportunities for future funding as well?
So we hope to be able to do this next year as well, but we don't have that positively determined yet.
And there's a question about sort of the number of grants that we would award. And I think it will depend on the types of projects that we see coming in, but is there more that you wanted to say about that?
No, that's exactly right. It'll depend on the projects.
Okay. Because we anticipate they'll be coming, from organizations that are, have more capacity or have been doing this work for a while, and then we might get applications from very small community-based organizations that are just starting to engage in this work. So I don't think we want to set a limit on the number or the amount of grants that will be awarded. So a couple of questions about the reporting requirements and the type of data and information that we'll be requiring as a contingent on, as a part of receiving the grant.
Right. So we'll want organizations to submit a midterm and final narrative and a midterm and final financial report. And that'll basically say what you've done with the money and how much has been spent and what you plan to do with the remainder. And then for the final report, what you have done with it. We'll do phone call check-ins, probably 2 of them during the project timeline, just to see how things are going and see if there needs to be any changes in what's going on.
Let's see. So a couple of questions about sort of the populations that are the focus of these grants and some language access questions. Will you fund projects where the participants in the Know Your Rights trainings are people of all genders, or do they need to be focused only on women?
We will fund ones of all genders.
And as part of the application process, can you talk a little bit about the fact that the proposed activities can be provided in different languages and what sort of supports might be available for that?
We do hope that some of the grants that we get to fund will be working in languages other than English. And we hope that the organizations that apply have the resources for that. If they don't, then perhaps some of the money from the grant can go to exactly that.
And someone just asked if we have these slides in Spanish and we can make them available in Spanish on the website as well as the grant application. Let's see. Sorry, I'm scrolling through all the questions here. There's a lot of good ones. We answered a lot of those. So one question, Sharon, that I think might be helpful for people to hear more about is whether people need to be proposing in their applications new projects, or can the funding support Know Your Rights or other kinds of work that organizations are already doing focused on this particular issue of workplace sexual harassment?
It can be either. If you have a new project that you want to propose, that's wonderful. If it's an existing project, that's equally wonderful. We're happy to do both.
Okay. And going back to funding for a minute, if an organization asks for a certain amount in their proposal, and if for some reason it's not possible to fund them at the full amount, would organizations be funded for a smaller grant, or is it sort of all or nothing in terms of the amount that they've asked for?
That's a good question. We anticipate that we would go back to the organization and explain, we can't give you what you asked for. What could you do with the smaller grant? And if that works out, we would go forward with that. So no, it's not all or nothing.
And another actually good question about joint applications for funding. Can a nonprofit and a government agency like the EEOC submit a joint application for funding?
I don't know the answer to that because I don't know how that would work with the money that we're giving and the type of organization that we are to be giving it to a governmental organization, but I will find out.
So then there's a question about prioritizing the types of work that people are requesting funding for. There's a specific question: are you going to prioritize Know Your Rights training over other forms of education and development of materials? And then
no,
similarly, do you have more specific priorities regarding the types of work or workers you're trying to reach?
So taking the first one, no, we don't, amongst the examples we gave of projects, we're interested in all of those, and we are very interested in seeing what groups come up with outside of those. Within the groups that we've identified as the ones where we would like to send our outreach, within the groups that we've identified for where we want to emphasize our outreach, we don't have a preference within those groups.
Can you talk a little bit about, or if there's any advice you have for applicants about deliverables and how success will be measured?
We've actually left that up to the applicant. So within the application, we've asked you to explain what you think success would look like and how that would be measured.
Can you give an example?
So an easy example would be using this money, we can do 5 more presentations, we can translate our materials, we can reach this number more of workers. Any of those would be examples of the kind of success we'd be looking for.
I think we have covered most of the questions. What if organizations are interested in doing outreach and know your rights work, but don't necessarily have the capacity to develop the know your rights material themselves? Could they use other groups' materials? Is that something that Time's Up Legal Defense Fund would provide?
We'd be happy to work with you on it. And yes, if you have other groups' materials that you think work well, as long as you're willing to actually do the work of the outreach, we think we could work with that.
And that's something that people should note in their application.
Absolutely.
Just wanted to loop back to an earlier question about whether we could provide these slides in Spanish and whether this webinar will be transcribed. We can. You just please make a specific request to the outreach grants email address, and we can take care of that. The previous webinar from last week was transcribed. I believe someone made a request, right? And that recording is on our website. I think that's it. I believe we've covered the questions that have come in so far. Of course, some of them, as we said, will require more follow-up and conversation. Also, after this webinar, feel free to send additional questions into the Outreach Grants email address so that we can follow up with you. Yeah, and so here's a question I think we just answered. Will you be open to outreach in other languages, excuse me, besides Spanish, geared to AAPI communities? Then the answer is yes.
Absolutely, yes.
And just to jump on to that as well, if you have a request to have our materials, our Know Your Rights materials at NWLC translated into any other specific language other than Spanish to do outreach to communities, you can reach out to us and we can get those materials translated for you. So our intake form and everything like that, our Know Your Rights materials around sexual harassment. We also, with our intake line here, are using language lines. So if anyone is contacting us in any language, be it Spanish, English, or any other language, we are able to take those intakes both through our intake form and on the phone. So we definitely want to work with folks to ensure that our materials are able to reach everyone that we're trying to serve.
Great. Okay, I think that's it. I haven't seen any new questions come in the last couple of minutes. Again, we'll be posting a recording of this webinar on the website so that you can listen to the Q&A portion again. And feel free to email us on the Outreach Grants email address so that we can follow up with you about something particular or that needs more discussion. And just a reminder that the application is up on the NWLC website already. The deadline for filing applications for funding is June 29th, and we'll be announcing the decisions for the awardees on August 6th. So please do get your applications in soon. And again, email us if you have any questions while you're working on the applications. Thank you so much for everyone for being here today. Thank you to Caitlin. Thank you to Sharon. And we hope to hear from you soon. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Thanks.